Thank you for joining me for my presentation on cannabis and sleep disturbances. My name is Terrence Shenfield, and I am actually an education coordinator for respiratory therapy. I actually received my master's in complementary and alternative medicine. I had a deep love for integrative medicine. I did a focus of herbal medicine and essential oils, so understanding how cannabis works was rather easy for me. Many people have used cannabis because of sleep problems. Sleep is essential for maintaining our mental and physical health, and many studies prove to that. According to the National Sleep Foundation, 50 to almost 70 million U.S. adults experience some form of sleep disorders, with about 30 to 40% of them experiencing insomnia. So getting a good night's sleep is really important. With so many people experiencing sleep disorders, there has been a rise of interest in one of the most controversial cures, cannabis. Many of the medical marijuana community refer to cannabis as an effective treatment with little to no side effects for a range of sleeping disorders. Basically, this lecture is going to speak about cannabis, the evidence that supports it, and also the evidence that says it's not that good. And I hope you enjoy this presentation. The objectives of today's presentation will be speaking to the stages of sleep. I will speak about sleep anatomy. I'll talk about the circadian rhythm and the sleep-wake restorative process. I'll give you a background on the endocannabinoid system. And then I'll talk to you about the role of cannabis in sleep. And I will mention about dependency. And then I'll also talk about some of the negative aspects of cannabis with sleep disorders. So sit back and enjoy. So why is sleep so important? To maintain good health, you need to eat right, you need to do some exercise, and you need to sleep. Those are the three basic things to keep healthy. And a lot of us don't get enough sleep. A lot of us say that 5 hours of sleep is just all we need, and that's not true. Evidence has shown that most people need anywhere from 7 to 9 hours of sleep to maintain good health. There are many reasons why sleep is important. For example, memory consolidation. Memory consolidation is that each day we are bombarded with so many different thoughts, so many different items going in our brain that we have to sort of make sense of it all. And sometimes during sleep, especially with REM sleep, we do a drill called memory consolidation, where all those thoughts and processes are put in a nice categorized way. Another thing is sleep is important for diabetes. Evidence has shown that patients who have good sleep have lower cases of diabetes. I cannot stress enough about cognitive improvement. For example, there was a time when I was under a lot of stress and that I couldn't sleep very well. After 3 days of not sleeping very well, my cognitive ability really diminished. People obviously saw a change in me. So cognitive improvement, good sleep is very important. New studies also show that cardiovascular disease and health is mitigated with good sleep. Also weight loss. Also, our immune system, when you get a good night's sleep, our immunity is up, and the immune system is very important to maintain your health. And most of us heal at night. In other words, when we sleep, this is the restorative process of our body to maintain good health. So all of these reasons add up to why is sleep important. The sequence of events for sleep cycles is pretty clear. Basically, there are 4 stages of sleep. And you go through each of these stages one at a time. So you go from 1 to 2 to 2 to 3 and 3 to 4. When you're in REM sleep, you're basically in stage 4. So once REM sleep is over, you actually flip back to stage 2. And typically with these sequences, you go through 4 or 5 of these cycles each night. So 4 or 5 times you go through stages 2 to 4. And at the end of the day or the end of the morning when you wake up, you're refreshed. Typically, REM sleep occurs around 90 minutes after your first stages go through. And as your time of sleep increases, your REM sleep increases too. So by the end of stage 3 and 4, you're really starting to sleep in REM sleep for over an hour, and then you go back to stage 2. So these are the sequences of sleep stages. I wanted to get into more details about non-REM sleep. In stage 1 of non-REM sleep, or otherwise called dreamless sleep, this occurs after you have decided to go to sleep and your eyes are closed, and during this stage, which typically lasts anywhere from 1 to 10 minutes, you are lightly asleep, and you can quickly return to being fully awake. You may wake up feeling like you did not sleep at all. Your body's muscles are not inhibited yet. Your eyes roll a little bit, and you may slightly open your eyelids. Your breathing slows down, and your heart rate becomes more regular. Your blood pressure and your brain temperature decreases. At this point, you might also get what is known as a hypnic jerk. The hypnic jerk is a sense of falling. So if you ever feel like you fell and your body twitches, that is during stage 1. In stage 2 sleep, it becomes harder to wake up. Your brain starts to emit larger waves, your blood pressure also decreases, and other metabolic functions slow down too. The first 2 stages of non-REM sleep together are often referred to as light sleep. And also, did you know that 45% of your total sleep is spent in this stage, in stage 2? During stage 3 sleep, this stage typically lasts anywhere from 35 to 45 minutes after falling asleep. Your brain waves slow down and your waves become much larger. At this point, you sleep through most potential sleep disturbances. In other words, noises don't wake you up, and it's kind of hard to wake you up at this time. If you do wake up during this stage, there's a high probability you're going to feel very disoriented for a few minutes. So this is the time when you say, where the hell am I? During stage 4, this is the final stage of the sleep cycle. This is the first rapid eye movement stage. This is called REM sleep, and typically lasts for about 10 minutes during the first stage, and then increases up to 90 minutes as we go on throughout the night. As the name indicates, your eyes move rapidly in all directions during rapid eye movement sleep, and it's during this stage of sleep, which is the deepest, that powerful dreams occur. So you dream in REM stage 4. Typically, REM stages increase throughout the night. They start off slow for about 10 minutes, but then your last REM sleep could be up to 90 minutes. So these are the 4 stages of sleep, and a little bit more detail how they work. When you get a sleep study, they attach electrodes to different portions of your skull, and as a result of that, they could pick up different waveforms that are being transmitted by your brain and during sleep. So for example, when you're awake, that's what's called beta waves. And beta waves occur when you're awake. They have the highest frequency and the lowest amplitude compared to other waves. And they also have a lot of variability with the waveform. When you get into stage 1, that is called alpha waves. And alpha waves occur during wakefulness, and also they also appear at periods of relaxation. Suppose you're meditating. This is a time when you'll get alpha waves. These waves are slower. They have less amplitude and variability than beta waves. Finally, we get into what is known as theta waves, and that is stage 2. Theta waves occur during stages 1 and 2 and are slower in frequency and greater in amplitude than alpha waves. As a person moves from stage 1 and 2 sleep, the theta waves activity continues. And during the theta waves, you get these very interesting things called sleep spindles or K complexes, and they actually have a function, and their function is to suppress cortical arousal in response to stimuli that the sleeping brain evaluates as not a danger signal. For example, when you're trying to fall asleep and you hear a noise, you don't wake up because your brain says this is not dangerous. And the second part of that, it adds in sleep-based memory consolidation. And finally, you get into your delta waves, and your delta waves occur, and those are the slowest waves and the highest amplitude, and this is the time when you're in your deepest sleep. And then finally you get into REM sleep, and as we all know, REM sleep is when you actually dream. I wanted to get into different parts of the brain that are involved with sleep. And at the same time, I want you to recognize that each of these regions in the brain contain CB1 receptor sites. As you will learn later, the CB1 receptor site has a strong affinity for THC. So cannabis, and especially the THC in cannabis, has an impact on all these different brain regions. The hypothalamus, which is a peanut-sized structure inside the brain, contains groups of nerve cells that act as a control center affecting sleep and arousal. Within the hypothalamus is what is known as the SCN. These are clusters of thousands of cells that receive information about light exposure directly from our eyes and control your behavioral rhythms. The brain stem, which is located at the base of the brain, communicates with the hypothalamus to control the transition between the wake and sleep cycles. The brain stem includes structures called the pons, the medulla, and the midbrain. Sleep-promoting cells within the hypothalamus of the brain produce a chemical called GABA. GABA acts to reduce the activity of arousal centers in the hypothalamus and brainstem. The brainstem, especially the pons and medulla, also play an important role with REM sleep. Basically, what it does is send signals to your muscles to relax and not move so that you don't act out during dreams. Because if you're going into a fight in your dream, you don't want to accidentally punch your spouse. The thalamus acts as a relay for information from the senses to the cerebral cortex. And basically, during most stages of sleep, the thalamus becomes inactive. The only time the thalamus becomes active is when you are dreaming. So when you're dreaming, your thalamus becomes active, and this happens in REM sleep. The penal gland, which is located in the brain's two hemispheres, receives signals from the SCN and increases the production of melatonin. We all know about melatonin. Melatonin controls your sleep cycles. And people who have lost their sight and cannot coordinate with their natural wake cycle sometimes use small amounts of melatonin to actually balance their sleep. Scientists believe that the peaks and valleys of melatonin over time are important for matching the body's circadian rhythm to external cycle of light and darkness. And now we get into amygdala. Basically, this is an almond-shaped structure involved in processing emotions, and this becomes really, really active in REM sleep. So these are the different parts of the brain, and these all play an important part with sleep. And you'll realize as time goes on that these parts of the brain are also loaded with the CB1 receptors, and that's how they impact, cannabis impacts the sleep cycles. Let's talk about the circadian rhythm. I am sure you all have heard of circadian rhythm, and probably what you heard less about is what is known as sleep-wake homeostasis. Circadian rhythms are governed by a master clock. Basically, it's a group of neurons called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. These are located in the region of the brain called the hypothalamus. This master clock translates cues from the environment into directives of the body. For examples, receptors in the eyes detect darkness and pass that signal along the SCN nucleus, which then stimulates the production of melatonin. When you have melatonin in your system, this is when you start feeling sleepy. Now, we all have heard of the word homeostasis. Homeostasis is a very important concept in humans and all other animals. That means your body is balanced. Homeostasis in general is any kind of internal biochemical system that regulates the body's internal environment with a view to maintaining properties such as temperature, pH, and other conditions. When you talk about the sleep-wake homeostasis, this can be thought of a kind of internal timer or counter that generates a homeostatic sleep drive or pressure for sleep as a function of the amount of time elapsed since the last adequate sleep episode. So basically what this means is our bodies can tell how many hours we've been up without sleep, and through a natural process, chemicals are released in our body that tell us, hey, we need to sleep. Also, These same chemicals, when we sleep and we have enough sleep, these same chemicals are produced in our body that wakes us up. So that is called the sleep-wake homeostasis, and that works very well with our circadian rhythms. So now that we have a good understanding about sleep anatomy and the stages of sleep, let's talk about how cannabis impacts your sleep. So to really have a good understanding of this, you need to understand certain facts, like what exactly is the endocannabinoid system, and you also need to know how cannabis impacts your sleep. And some people want to know, is cannabis habit forming? Is this a gateway drug? Some people who've been using cannabis for a long time and stop abruptly have withdrawal symptoms, so I'll talk about that. And I'm also going to be talking about the role of the endocannabinoid system with the circadian sleep cycle, which is a very, very important cycle. I'm going to talk about the role of CBD on insomnia, sleep quality, and you have to understand that insomnia is actually a qualifying condition for medical cannabis. So at the end of this presentation, you're going to be pretty well versed on all of these categories. So you might be asking yourself, who is Raphael Mechoulam? Raphael Mechoulam is an Israeli scientist who is considered the godfather of medical marijuana. Raphael Mechoulam was born in Bulgaria in the 1930s and then immigrated with his family to Israel in 1949. He studied chemistry and then received his PhD, which had a thesis on the chemistry of steroids. After postdoctoral studies at the Rockefeller Institute in New York, he was on scientific staff at the Weizmann Institute. He's also a professor at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He moved back to Israel, and actually he's a major scientific studier of the chemistry and pharmacology of cannabinoids. And some interesting statement. I am sure all of you have heard of THC and you've all heard of CBD. Which one did you hear about first? I'm sure, like many of us, you heard about THC. But actually, cannabidiol, CBD, was first identified by Raphael Mechoulam back in the 1960s. And when you really think about the plant, the medical marijuana plant, the two major constituents or chemicals in the plant, which they call cannabinoids, is THC and CBD. There are other cannabinoids, but CBD and THC are the most. And when you look at the percentage, the cannabis plant has almost 40% of CBD, cannabidiol, and a lower percentage of THC. So Raphael Mechoulam is still alive. He's in Israel. He's a pioneer in the research of medical marijuana. And you got to remember, in the United States, marijuana is considered a Schedule I drug. As a result of that, there's not much research being done on it because it's illegal. But in Israel, they don't consider marijuana a Schedule I drug, and the research has been carried out for years. So Israel as a country is probably a world leader in cannabis research. And this high guy, Raphael Mechoulam, is considered the godfather. He's got a big research center, and they do some great research in Israel. And if you ever want to look up his name, he's like wonderful guy. So let's talk more about the CB1 and CB2 receptors. The CB1 receptor is mostly found in the brain and peripheral nervous system. The CB2 receptor is found mostly in our gut and also our immune system. It's on most of our T cells, B cells, so it has a very, very important part in immunity and also has a very, very part for inflammatory diseases and processes. So let me just say something. When you think about cannabis, people get high on cannabis. And the reason for that is THC has a strong affinity for the CB1 receptor site. And the CB1 receptor site is located in the brain. So it impacts memory, it impacts coordination, and that is why you feel high. The CB2 receptors, as I was saying before, are mostly located in the immune system and gut. And a lot of times if you use cannabis product, it's good for irritable bowel syndrome, because the irritable bowel syndrome is part of the gut, and actually there's so much knowledge out there that the CB2 receptors are very involved with inflammation processes in the body, and like irritable bowel syndrome, Crohn's disease, and also arthritis. And we'll get more into that. So CB1 in the brain and peripheral nervous system. CB2 is in our immune system as well as our gut. This slide right here will give you the strong foundation of understanding what the endocannabinoid system is. The endocannabinoid system was discovered back in the 1960s by who? Raphael Mechoulam. And during this time, they realized that all mammals, including humans, have these receptor sites in our body called CB1 and CB2 receptor sites. The CB1 receptor site is mostly located in the brain and the peripheral nervous system, where the CB2 receptor site is mostly found in our immune system as well as our gut. The purpose of the CB1 and CB2 receptor sites is to get certain neurotransmitters or hormones attached to them in various situations. For example, when you feel sleepy, certain hormones are produced in the body. When you feel hunger, certain hormones are produced in the body. When you are in pain, there are certain neurotransmitters produced so that it can lessen the pain. So to understand this, our bodies produce two chemicals. One is called anandamide and the other one is called 2-AG. And the purpose of these chemicals is to attach to the CB1 and CB2 receptor sites. So when we produce enough of these hormones like anandamide and 2-AG, and it attaches to the CB1 and CB2 receptor sites, we are in homeostasis. So we produce enough chemical, it attaches to our receptor sites, we are perfect. The structure of CB1 and CB2 receptor sites is almost like a prostaglandin structure. And this is very important. Now, why does cannabis work? They found out that the molecular structure of THC is almost equivalent to anandamide and 2-AG. THC actually attaches to the CB1 and CB2 receptor site. But you really don't need external THC in your body if you produce enough anandamide and 2-AG. So the whole purpose here, what I'm trying to say is that our bodies have these two receptor sites. One is called the CB1, the other one is called a CB2. All mammals have it. It's not just dogs, cats, birds, whatever. And we also produce these two chemicals called anandamide and 2-AG. And when we reproduce these chemicals and they attach to the CB1, CB2 receptor site, we have what is known as homeostasis. Sometimes our bodies don't produce enough of these chemicals or they degrade, and that is why cannabis may work. As I said before, the THC molecule almost has the same molecular shape as anandamide and 2-AG, and it fits perfectly into the CB1 and CB2 receptors, actually eliciting some kind of physiologic response. And we'll get more into that later. So that is why cannabis works. Now you may be wondering, what's the role of CBD, cannabidiol? What cannabidiol does, cannabidiol prevents the degradation of anandamide and 2-AG. So what does that mean? That means our bodies produce anandamide, our body also produces 2-AG, and when you take CBD, it prevents the degradation of those two chemicals our bodies produce and actually puts us in a better state of homeostasis, and we'll get much more into that. But that's the basics of this whole concept of the CB1, CB2, anandamide 2-AG concept. At the time of this presentation, there are 26 states that have legalized medical marijuana, including the District of Columbia. Also, 7 states have actually legalized recreational marijuana besides medical cannabis. As a result of this cannabis use, some people abuse it, and they have a term for that. They call it cannabis use disorder, and this has been on the rise. Some of the concerns with cannabis use disorder is that some people who use cannabis all the time and they stop, they actually have rebound insomnia. So actually they can't sleep, they get irritable, they have anxiety. So I'll get a little bit more into that a little bit later, but there is a term and you should know it, cannabis use disorder. Veterans who have been in the war actually suffer from a condition called post-traumatic stress disorder, and many of the veterans have used cannabis to go to sleep, and it actually works very well. One of the diagnoses that you could get medical cannabis for is post-traumatic stress disorder, and it's been shown that there are good results with using cannabis for this population. I want to say that when not all cannabis is the same, the concentration of THC to CBD is a very, very important thing. You should understand the ratio of that. So veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder actually respond very well to cannabis that has a high CBD content with a low THC. And in regard to CBD, CBD is actually great for sleeping. There's been some good studies out there showing that it reduces anxiety. It actually reduces some kind of mild pain, mild to moderate pain. And they have shown that CBD actually improves the sleep quality of people, and it actually helps them fall asleep quicker because it relieves anxiety and it relieves mild to moderate pain. So we'll talk more about that as we go along. You can imagine that with the cannabis industry, that the U.S. pharmaceutical companies want to get part of it. What they want to do is make synthetic cannabinoids. What that means is they want to take the cannabis plant and they want to make the same kind of molecules in the test tube and actually mass produce it for pennies. And actually, there are a couple of drugs that are on the market which are actually synthetic THC. You might have heard of Marinol or Sesamet. They are both synthetic THC, and they are used for a host of medical conditions. For example, when you think of Marinol and Sesamet, they are actually prescribed for patients who have AIDS. And a lot of the AIDS patients actually have wasting syndrome, which means they lose a lot of weight. Also, patients with anorexia benefit from this medication. And also, if you get nausea from chemotherapy, that's another reason. Many veterans are starting to use these two prescribed medications for post-traumatic stress disorder with some kind of results, positive results with it. But I could tell you from research that any kind of product that is all THC will induce anxiety to you. So it's not necessarily the best thing. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. Another thing that's on the market now is CBD. CBD is derived from the cannabis plant, but basically they remove the THC component, so there's no psychoactive component. And CBD actually works very well for anxiety. It also works for mild to moderate pain. It works for mood disorders such as depression, and is good evidence, and also sleep. It actually improves sleep quality for those who have insomnia, not necessarily obstructive sleep apnea. And finally, in Canada, there is a new medication called Sativix. Sativix is actually pure cannabis product. It's not made synthetically. And what it is, they actually derived a 1-to-1 ratio. So it's like 1 part CBD, 1 part THC, and actually it comes in an oral spray. And this particular product has done wonders for patients with arthritic pain, any kind of mild to moderate pain, and it's actually given by prescription only. So this is called Sativix, and I guarantee you in a very short while it will be part of the U.S. pharmacological studies, and we will be offering it here by doctors. So when we think about the impact of cannabis on sleep, There were some original studies that were looking at the use of cannabis for sleep, and they were dated back in the 1970s. And at that point, they actually included polysomnography as part of the test. And at that time, they had some mixed findings and they could not replicate some studies. So, one of the values of a good study is if I find something works and I could duplicate that, that means it's a really good study. But they found that these studies at this time cannot be duplicated. Some of the take home points from this time was the use of cannabis actually decreased REM sleep. And REM sleep is really important. It actually reduced sleep onset latency, and it actually had a negative impact on sleep quality. They were also concerned about it being habit forming. And one of the biggest things was that when people stopped using cannabis, if you're a chronic user and you stop using cannabis, you actually have some sleep disturbances. And those could be as a result of some severe nightmares. So there is a withdrawal from cannabis, especially from heavy chronic users. So there are some cannabis users who are chronic users, and there are different levels of cannabis users, just as well as there's different levels of drinkers and different levels of smokers. And they have found that cannabis users who typically smoke at least 3 cannabis cigarettes a day and stop for some reason, and they could stop because their job is requiring them to, or whatever, they need to get a drug test or whatever, they have found that people who have stopped abruptly, 65% of them reported poor sleep as a result of stopping. And many of them, because of this poor sleep, ended up going back on. So one of the significant side effects of stopping cannabis after regular use for a long time is there's a withdrawal side, and the withdrawal side results mostly in insomnia for a few days. So for those who are chronic cannabis users and decide to stop, a lot of them end up having what is called cannabis withdrawal. And with cannabis withdrawal, there's some side effects. And some of those side effects are you have a decrease in total amount of time sleeping. You have a decrease in sleep efficiency. Sleep efficiency is described as the amount of time it takes you to be from awake to falling asleep. It also has a decrease in the percentage of REM sleep, and it's also an increase in the wake after sleep onset, which means that you after you sleep, you wake up and you stay awake for a while. There's another called sleep onset latency, which means that it actually takes you longer to fall asleep, and also periodic limb movements has been observed. Approximately 9% of all cannabis users become addicted, and the addiction to cannabis is not like the addiction to heroin. The addiction is you have a psychological addiction to it, and also if you try to stop, it takes at least 45 days to withdraw from it. And when I say withdrawal, the most common side effect of cannabis withdrawal is insomnia. So it's funny, some people take cannabis to go to sleep, and if they stop, they have all these problems with their sleep. But after 45 days, you're pretty well normalized. As I was mentioning earlier, the endocannabinoid system has a significant impact on different parts of the brain, as I described earlier, and those different parts of the brain have an impact on sleep. So the role of sleep in cannabis use is not surprising, as recent work has demonstrated that the endocannabinoid system is involved in the regulation of the circadian sleep-wake cycles, including maintenance and promotion of sleep. Specifically, it has been hypothesized that the endocannabinoid system serves as a link between the circadian regulation system and the behavioral and physiologic processes, including sleep. The role of the endocannabinoid system on the circadian rhythms has been further supported by work demonstrating that a lack of normal sleep causes dysregulation within the endocannabinoid system, while an elevation in the endocannabinoid system receptor level is involved in homeostatic recovery of sleep after non-normal sleep. So based on this, the endocannabinoid system is a critical system involved in the regulation of the circadian rhythm cycle, and this is why cannabis has a significant impact on sleep quality. This slide speaks to the fact of how cannabinoids impact sleep. Now, when you think about the cannabis plant, you mostly think of THC and CBD, but there are other chemicals or cannabinoids in the cannabis plant. For example, there's CBC, there's CBCA, there is CBD, there's a host of other things. But recent research has demonstrated that different types of plants have an impact. What I mean by that, all cannabis plants contain cannabinoids, THC and CBD, but some plants have a higher percentage of CBD versus THC. So understanding the ratio between THC and CBD is vital to understanding how it works on you. Another point that needs to be mentioned is the dosage and the route of administration. For example, if you take a capsule that contains CBD, it really takes about an hour to work. Where if you used a tincture of CBD under your tongue, it would work in 15 minutes. So dosing is another problem, or not a concern. I don't want to say problem. Dosing, you just don't overdose yourself. If you take the right dose, just like you take any other kind of medication, you'll have the best results. So dosing, ratio of THC to CBD, and how you take it all play an important role in your sleep cycle. To build on the last slide, I want to talk more about the role of THC only on sleep. So if you get a cannabis plant that has a higher level of THC, it will have a greater impact on the receptor sites in the brain, namely the CB1 receptors. And they have shown that high concentrations of THC actually disrupts the circadian rhythms. It actually results in intolerance to sleep. It actually disrupts your sleep patterns. So dosing is important. As little as 15 milligrams of THC has actually impacted sleep and memory the following day. So when you think about cannabis use and you think about using cannabis to go to sleep, you really need to understand the ratio of THC to CBD, and you really want to have a variety of plant or a hybrid plant that actually has high levels of CBD, low levels of THC. So let's build more on this. Let's talk about the role of CBD on the sleep-wake cycle. And CBD is actually a better choice than a high THC. CBD has a different effect on the sleep pattern versus THC. It actually has a calming effect. It actually has an anti-anxiety effect. It actually has a pain relieving effect. But dosing, like I was telling you, is really important. Low doses of CBD have been found to be stimulating, where higher doses actually improve sleep quality. Another thing about CBD, it actually improves REM sleep. So if you're going to get a cannabis product that you want to use for sleep, I strongly recommend something high in CBD, low in THC, because all the evidence support it. Let's talk more about CBD. Patients who use CBD actually have improvement in their sleep. It actually increases REM sleep, and it actually is very good for patients who have post-traumatic stress disorder. CBD actually reduces the nightmares that are associated with this disorder. It actually has anti-anxiety effects. It actually decreases stage 3 sleep in young adults. And the difference with that between THC and CBD, THC preparations have been associated with decreased sleep latency. What that means is if you get cannabis from a distributor or a dispenser, make sure you get something that's high levels of CBD, low levels of THC. If you think you get some cannabis from somewhere else and you think it's going to help you sleep, you don't know what you're going to get from the ratio. So that's why it's really important to understand the ratio of both. I think you're going to find these couple of next slides kind of interesting. We all have heard of obstructive sleep apnea. And you know what happens with obstructive sleep apnea. Basically, your tongue rolls back and you occlude your airway. And you become hypoxic and a whole bit like that. And they have been doing some studies of the use of cannabis for obstructive sleep apnea. And I think my respiratory brothers and sisters are going to find this kind of interesting. I think all my respiratory brothers and sisters are going to find this really interesting. The typical treatment for obstructive sleep apnea is CPAP. They have been doing studies on this system called the serotonin-mediated symptoms of OSA. And basically, what it is serotonin is involved in the control of respirations in multiple sites in the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. They have found the role of serotonin in obstructive sleep apnea, and they have found that if you actually suppress the amount of serotonin in the brain, you actually improve the sleep quality or the tonic effects of the airway. So what they found is that THC reduced apneic events. It actually suppressed the serotonin-mediated symptoms of OSA, and it actually kept the airway open by stimulating the motor neurons in the upper airway. So kind of interesting that they're actually doing studies with THC and finding it has a tonic effect on the airway muscles, and this way keeping your airway open so you don't have to use CPAP. So this is in the beginning stages and going to do more research on it. Have you ever heard of REM behavior disorder? Many patients with Parkinson's suffer from this disorder, and how this works is like this. When you are in REM sleep, typically your muscles are paralyzed. Your brain is telling you don't move your muscles, but you are dreaming you're running through a field, or you're fighting, or you're swimming, but actually you're not moving a muscle at all. Patients who suffer from REM behavior disorder in REM sleep actually can act out and move. So they can actually punch someone next to them or jump out of bed or hurt themselves. So they have found that CBD suppressed this. Actually, CBD worked very well for this particular disorder, especially for patients who suffer with Parkinson. With post-traumatic stress disorder, the most common effect is nightmares. These people have severe nightmares. They wake up, they can't sleep. It's a real problem. There's a drug called prazosin, which is used to treat that. This is the only drug that's used to treat post-traumatic stress disorder, especially related to nightmares. They actually do some studies with synthetic THC, nabilone, and they actually found that it reduced nightmares with this. So in medical cannabis, you could get a prescription if you suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder because it shows to reduce the nightmares that are associated with it. A lot of people have problems with sleep, and this results from the fact they have chronic pain. Chronic pain comes in many forms. You could have arthritis, you could have some back pain, you could have had some kind of trauma, and they actually sell Tylenol PM. What's Tylenol PM for? It actually reduces the pain you get. So they have found that it impacts your sleep. When you have chronic pain and you're uncomfortable, you can't sleep well. So they've done some studies using Sativix. Remember I was telling you about Sativix before? Sativix is a natural cannabis product, but it's sold by pharmaceutical companies. It has an exact ratio of 1:1 of THC to CBD, and it actually has improved the sleep of patients who are in chronic pain. Another very helpful thing that you don't need a prescription for is CBD. There's a lot of good studies showing that CBD works on chronic pain and actually improves your sleep too. There's a condition called excessive daytime sleepiness, and it's actually called EDS. And basically, this is you want to fall asleep during the day, you want to take a nap. And sometimes this is caused by some different medications. It could be caused by medical conditions. It could be a psychiatric condition. It could be narcolepsy. It could also be obstructive sleep apnea that makes you feel daytime sleepiness. There's a lot of negative consequences to daytime sleepiness, impaired memory, attention, the whole bit like that. And they've done some studies of using low-dose CBD in these patients. So people who use low-dose CBD actually have a stimulant effect and stay awake, which is a good thing. So I hope you enjoyed this presentation. Basically, I wanted you to understand how sleep medicine works and actually how the role of cannabinoids in sleep disorders is basically in its infancy. I wanted you to know about ratios of THC to CBD. I keep on stressing how important it is to understand ratios where you need something high CBD, low THC. You have to understand that some people become addicted to cannabis, which even though the numbers are very low, only 9%, that means 91% don't become addicted. But you have to understand that some people who stop cannabis altogether have a problem with sleep, and typically this lasts for 45 days. There's more research coming out on the horizon, and I hope you really enjoyed this presentation. I wanted to list some good references, so if you ever have any interest to actually do a little research on this and dig a little further on it, these are great references for you to have, and I'm more than happy to talk to you after this conference or anytime about how cannabis works and all that. And you have a great day.